Hello, and thank you for attending today's webinar. We are going to be looking at GSPR and compliance needs for your products when you're expanding into the EU. My name is Liam Payne, and I am a Business Development and Partnerships Manager here at SimplyVAT. SimplyVAT is a company that is for international taxes and compliance. So when we're looking at the compliance side of today's webinar, I'll be able to talk through the VAT requirements. I'm also joined here by Dave from Hooley Brown. And Dave, I don't know whether you want to just quickly introduce yourself and Hooley Brown.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dave. I'm director at Hooley Brown. Hooley Brown is we provide management support and advisory services for consumer brands looking to export to the European Union and the UK. And we help with things like regulatory compliance in terms of product safety, labeling, translations, packaging adaptation, certifications. So we will help you and any brands with GPSR compliance.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that summary. So looking further at today's webinar, what we're going to be covering in today's webinar is we're going to start off with Dave shortly, looking at what is GSPR and why do I need it, the compliance need for the EU expansions and expansion into the EU, kind of what's required, GSPR, VAT, etc. And at the end, we will also be then going through some commonly asked questions throughout the GSPR and VAT topics. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Dave and we'll get started on what GSPR is.
Okay, great. So what's GPSR? GPSR stands for the General Product Safety Regulation. It's a European regulation that is actually a bit of a revamp of an old regulation called the General Product Safety Directive. That has been around for about 2 decades, but it was about time for some new updates to this regulation because we have new ways of selling. We can sell online now. We can sell through e-commerce. We've got all sorts of new products on the market that we're not otherwise covered of. So this is a regulation that's basically for all products. For a lot of products that are not otherwise regulated, there are some exemptions such as food, aircrafts, antiques, and so on. But most products that are regulated by this, and it ensures that manufacturers and brands that place products on the market and sell them to European consumers have carried out risk assessments to make sure that the product is safe for European consumers. It also applies to digital products, which is new because obviously 20 years ago we didn't have that. Nowadays we do have digital products, and they're also covered by it. So essentially what the GPSR does, it sets out certain requirements for manufacturers in particular to make sure that they have carried out a safety assessment and that they have got proof of these safety assessments in terms of like laboratory tests according to standards if they exist, or standard or harmonized standards if they exist for that category, and to determine that there's safety warnings, and that safety warnings are also making it onto the packaging. So GPSR has already come into force. It came into force on the 13th of December 2024. So it already applies. But in reality, it actually is building on the General Product Safety Directive, which has been around for 20 years. So a lot of the principles that we find in GPSR are requirements that brands and manufacturers should already have complied with anyway. Also what GPSR has achieved is also expands the numbers of actors that are involved in the process. So not just the manufacturer plays a role anymore. It also applies to fulfillment service providers, online marketplaces, and if the manufacturer is not located in the European Union, they can also appoint a responsible person who is located in the European Union to take care of these compliance duties on their behalf. So a service provider like Hooley Brown with offices in the Netherlands can do this for brands that are based from outside the European Union, and we can help you work through the compliance requirements in the EU. So, what are some of the key requirements of GPSR? So, the key requirement is to work through compliance. So, there's often this different standards around the world, and if you work with manufacturers that are not based in the European Union, very likely they're not necessarily producing to European standards. So, the first thing you need to do is decide for yourself whether determine whether you yourself are based in the European Union. If you're not in the European Union, you might want to appoint a responsible person to help you with this. So a business like Hooley Brown that is established in the European Union and can help you with these safety assessments. The next thing that you then need to do is you need to create what's known as a technical dossier. And basically, what we're looking at is what the category of the product, which harmonized standards apply to their product, whether the safety certification that has been supplied by the manufacturer recognizes compliance with these safety standards, and if it doesn't, there may be some additional steps involved in verifying compliance, for example, by doing some laboratory tests. And the third step is to determine whether there's any safety information that needs to go on the labeling and it needs to go in online listings, and to translate that to make sure that that is available to consumers. Also, what needs to be put on labeling is traceability details. So information from the manufacturer address, if they're based in the European Union. If they're not based in the European Union, the address of a business that represents you in the European Union, such as the responsible person. And this must also include a postal address and an electronic address. And what's important, you need to have details such as SKU numbers, batch numbers, serial codes, anything that helps to do with traceability. Because why does that matter? If a product is found faulty or unsafe or uncompliant with European standards and it needs to be removed from the market, what we want to avoid is a general recall of all of your products. And by having a very good traceability system in place, you'll be able to determine whether this is an issue with a specific batch where something has gone wrong, and then only those products from that batch needs to be recalled instead of having a very costly recall of all of your products. So traceability has become a very important plays a very important role in ensuring safety and compliance once a product is out in the market.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for this, Dave. I'm just going to run through now the triggers for requirement for VAT registration within the EU. So just to kind of tie back in, if you're needing kind of GSPR, it can often need that you will require a VAT registration. So just to go over the basics of this, each country has different rules surrounding triggers of a VAT registration requirement. However, there are some rules that don't tend to differ kind of around the EU. That typically is like holding stock in an EU member state for the B2C EU-wide sales and fulfillment, and also the B2B sales from kind of one member state to another. The other side would be DDP supplies to EU customers from an outside of EU location, typically direct to consumer, but again, it can be, as mentioned below, acting as the importer record on B2B supplies. When I say kind of like DDP, that stands for delivery duties paid. And that's typically, if we're looking at it on a B2C kind of sale point of view, that's when the goods are sent from an outside of EU location where you've collected the VAT at point of checkout. So it removes the liability for your customer to cover those goods when they land in the country. However, when we're looking at the EU as well, there is no threshold for VAT registration. So if you, as a supplier, are collecting VAT on the supplies, then you will need to register from the first taxable transaction made to the EU. And when the goods are located, however, outside the EU at point of sale, you actually have the option of sending the goods DAP, which is delivered at place, where the clients will be collecting the VAT and remitting the VAT on the side when the goods land with them in the country of arrival. So it's only triggered if you're, say, holding stock. If we're tying it back to the GPSR, then if you're kind of using the import one-stop shop registration, for example, where you're sending goods from the UK into a consumer in the EU, if you're collecting the VAT on those supplies, you'll be triggered to have the import one-stop shop. or a local VAT registration, depending on the product value. Looking further into the kind of like the distance sale of these imported goods, just to really hone in on the last slide there, when you're selling goods to an EU consumers, whether goods located outside the EU, as I've just mentioned, the goods are always taxable in the EU, and it's also crucial for you to understand what VAT rights apply to your products in each EU country. So whether your goods are applicable to a standard rate, a reduced rate, or zero rate, that is very crucial for you to understand to ensure the correct amount of VAT is being collected and remitted to the relevant authorities. And even as mentioned there as well, it's always taxable inside the EU. So whether that's yourself collecting it on behalf of your end consumer or your end consumer covering the goods when the goods land with them in the member state. And if you're a UK business, for example, as well, due to now the hard border being between the UK and the EU, all commercial items are subject to customs charges, which are import tax and import duties. Import duties do only apply for consignments over €150, but if your goods are above that, then they will apply for you. And it's always the importer of record who is responsible for these charges. So that will either be, as mentioned, yourself or your client, whoever is the one covering that VAT when the goods land. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to bring Dave back on the stage, and we're going to start looking at some case studies to tie in what we've just discussed over the last 4 slides. So I'll hand over to Dave to kind of run through this side, and then I'll jump in a minute.
Yeah. So one of the case studies that we discussed in the team is being quite interesting for GPSR is the case of swim rings, where a company sells swim rings. And why swim rings, why they're interesting, is because they're a typical GPSR product, but they're actually regulated in different ways. Because when you think of like goods like swim rings, which you can use either as there could be a toy, because in this case you see a picture of a small child using it. So there could be toys like the large inflatables that have a shape of like a killer whale or a big fish or a pizza slice. They might be considered toys. Whereas if you've got inflatable rings that go around the armbands and so on, they obviously serve a protective function for children. And you can also think of swim rings used by swim guards, like the hard plasticky ones, to save people. So these are different types of swim rings, which are all look similar, and you would think they are regulated in a similar way, but actually they aren't. So there are different categories. They could fall within different categories. There's regulated standards for toys. There's regulated standards for personal protective equipment, and there's if neither of those categories applies to the product, then the GPSR requirements would come in as a fallback. So why does that matter? As you can imagine, a product that is classified for as personal protective equipment will have very high safety standards, because not only needs to protect humans, it also needs to be safe over a long period of time and certain specific loads or extreme weather conditions and so on. So there's a lot of testing involved to ensure that a product meets very specific standards for functionality. As you can imagine, in the case of toys are obviously marketed to children, so the use considerations are a bit different, because children will not necessarily interact with goods as adults would. So within toys, we're particularly looking at like whether things could cause a suffocation risk or could get loose and children might swallow it. So there again, different safety standards that might not have so much to do with extreme weather conditions, but with how children might use it. So that's quite neat, because in those cases we've got specific sets of standards that are well known, and we can test for it, produce a declaration of conformity, and that's the end of it. If it's a GPSR product, it's a little bit trickier, because we haven't necessarily got the same standards that are regulated by law that we're looking at. So in this case, the question starts with, okay, well, I want to sell swim rings. I'm based in the UK. So in the UK, we're outside of the European Union now. And if we want to sell in Greece, France, Spain, and Italy, it means that we'll have to start by making sure that we got an EORI number and VAT setup. because that takes quite a bit of time for different markets. The next step would be to look at contracting a responsible person inside the European Union to help create a technical dossier for GPSR requirements. Then determine for your products whether they are a PPE product, a toy product, or a GPSR product. And from that, you'll then create a technical dossier. So in the technical dossier, you would then say like, okay, this is not a toy or a PPE product, but it will be a GPSR product. So what do you then do to determine whether the product is safe? Now, the European Union has issued long lists of harmonized standards that are not that have been published and recognized in law. So while there might not be a specific standard in the regulation itself, there will be harmonized standards that industry believes are correct for this type of product. So the first thing you can do, or that a responsible person will do for you, is look at this list of harmonized standards to see whether there are any standards there that cover your product. Now, obviously, in this case, we know that that's the case. There's about 5 or 6 standards that have to do with leisure goods that are used in aquatic environments, like swim rings. So you would look at using those standards to guide you into the safety requirements. Those standards also involve some safety instructions that you can put on the label of your products and what you would need to translate into different languages. So this technical dossier that you would then have will have a list of requirements of these harmonized standards that your product will need to comply to. And then your next step would be to work with a manufacturer, with your manufacturer at home, or wherever they're based, but in this case, based in the UK, to verify that all these requirements are met prior to launching your products in the European Union. Then it's also in the GPSR regulations very important that you have the correct warning statements on the product itself. But also you can also have it in a digital format. If you have, for example, QR codes that goes to your website, and you would have some labeling on the physical product and packaging, and more information might be available in a digital format. And in this case, it might be a swim product, a swim ring that's marketed to a younger, well, to a kid essentially. So you would also look at like the age suitability. So even if it's not a toy, you would still have to give an indication of suitability, like what age groups could use this product. And the last step that you would need to do is you would need to consider whether some of your materials, particularly materials that might have like more complicated assembly or have a lot of warnings, they might need to be translated into the different languages so that consumers have access to this information. So yeah, that's a clear case of a GPSR.
Perfect, thank you. I'm just going to quickly run through, I guess, the VAT requirements on the back of those ones. So if we're looking at that particular case study, with the VAT requirements for the UK company selling into the EU, the VAT liability will depend on the route of supply. As Dave mentioned, obviously the VAT and ERI number is very important, and it can sometimes take a while to obtain dependent on the member state that you're looking at expanding into. So if we're looking at it in 2 different ways, I guess, if a UK business in this example is sending goods to a distributor in the EU, who'll be taking ownership of the goods and sending goods under their name, then it will depend on who acts as the importer of record on these supplies. So if the goods are, say, going from the UK to a distributor in, I believe, France or another one of the member states that was noted, then it will depend whether the UK business is acting as the kind of importer, covering the VAT, covering those duties, as to whether they'll trigger a need for a VAT requirement in that member state. However, if the business in the EU, as mentioned there as well, if they're not going to act as the importer of record, then it will trigger the need for the UK business to hold that VAT number. On the flip side of it, if the UK business is going to be holding stock in a local kind of 3PL or fulfillment center within the member states and sending directly, either direct to consumer or direct to other businesses, then they will need a VAT number in each member state where their goods are being held and sold from, and also an EORI number at the first point of entry. I say first point of entry in a sense where the goods, whatever member state is going to be the one where the goods get imported into first, or because you only really need the one. So you can import into all 4 member states, but you will just need that ERA number in that initial port there as well. And looking forward then, we've got one more kind of case study to go through, which is slightly different, and I'll let Dave kind of run through this one.
So in this case study, we're looking at a skincare company from the US. Why is skincare interesting? Well, in many cases, there's many similarities to the previous case of the swim ring. Again, a company from based in Los Angeles, an American company, is based outside of the European Union, and will need to make sure that their products comply with European Union rules. Now, like the previous case where where I mentioned that toys and personal protective equipment have regulated standards, cosmetics also have very extensive European regulations, and they're called cosmetic regulations. And every cosmetic product under the sun will need to comply with those regulations. And there's a very specific, which says has very specific requirements in terms of composition, labeling, notification duties. So cosmetics have to be notified to the CPNP portal in the European Union prior to being launched in the on the EU market. So it's a product category that's actually very heavily regulated. So at first glance, you wouldn't necessarily think that there would be a GPSR product, but there are aspects of cosmetic sales that are considered part of GPSR, particularly so when cosmetics are sold online, for example, through a Shopify website or through Amazon, because unlike food products or medicinal products, cosmetics are not explicitly exempt from the scope of GPSR regulations. So a company that sells cosmetics through online platforms will also have to deal with the GPSR requirements for product recalls, information that needs to be made available online, and for filing notifications through the Safety Gate portal. Otherwise, a lot of American companies will now have been going through the MOCRA compliance programs. So in the US, the new cosmetic regulations are getting businesses ready for how to deal with serious adverse events or adverse events, how to notify them to the authorities if something goes wrong, safety requirements, new labeling requirements. So all of that will still exist, and it's very similar in the European Union. So the first steps that a cosmetic company would take, other than apply for a VAT and a EORI number, is also to work with a responsible person for both in the context of the cosmetic regulation, which requires a responsible person, and for the GPSR requirements, which also requires a responsible person. Unfortunately, it's the same legal definition, but you will find that some companies sell responsible person only in the context of cosmetic safety, and they're not necessarily dealing with the GPSR aspects. And other companies that deal with GPSR are not necessarily capable of doing the cosmetic safety compliance. At Hooley Brown, we cover both those categories, so it could be a responsible person for whichever type you want to sell, whether you want to sell cosmetics through retail chains or whether you want to sell them online yourself. So we would help you then create product information files that have details about your manufacturing facilities, how your products comply with EU regulations, a safety assessment, the correct labeling for the European Union, including translations in, for example, key markets like France and Spain, and to also help you notify the products in the UK and EU if you want to launch in both markets. Many cosmetic companies will also stock additional products that, for example, makeup bags or applicators or brushes or puffs, and these products would all be GPSR products, and they don't have to do anything to do with cosmetics products, but they would fall under the GPSR regulations. So in those cases, we'll be specifically looking at textiles, whether the textiles have been labeling correctly, whether we're under the textile regulations, and made sure that the same technical dossier has been created for these products.
Perfect. So yeah, obviously, if we're looking then moving forward with this kind of the VT requirements on the back of that case study. So as mentioned, that the US company is looking to hold stock within the Netherlands, sell on both Amazon and I believe also their own website there as well. So for this, obviously, the client will, as always, require a VAT number and a Euro number within the Netherlands due to the initial importation and the holding of the stock there. And with Amazon, so we split the supply into two different sections. If we're looking at Amazon first, if they're using one of Amazon's fulfillment schemes operating from the warehouse in the Netherlands, for example, then Amazon will likely act as a deemed supplier on these sales. And so no further obligations will be triggered. Or if you enter into a pan-EU or FBA scheme in other European markets, then further VAT registrations will be needed there as well. For example, Dave mentioned there some common markets are like Italy, Spain, France. So if you were to hold stock in those three markets with Amazon, you will then trigger the need for those three further VAT registrations as well. If we're looking at the further supply, which is the own website sales, if they're holding stock for direct-to-consumer sales from the Netherlands and they're using a 3PL or fulfillment partner there, then there will be a further registration triggered, which is called a one-stop shop, which I'm just going to go through with you shortly. So if we're looking at the Union One-Stop Shop, when the new VAT rules were changed in 2021, there was an introduction of a few different one-stop shop registrations. It basically allows you to collect and remit VAT on sales to all member states under one simple registration, one payment, one return. It's very, simplistic for someone starting in the EU and getting no sales moving forward. So if we're tying it back to the case study as well, if we're looking at the one-stop shop, if they're holding stock in the Netherlands, they'll need a one-stop shop registered in the Netherlands scheme. So looking at what it is in depth, it's an additional scheme, as mentioned, to report the VAT due on intra-EU B2C supplies in a single registration. Each member state have their own online portals, and non-EU businesses can use it for their intra-EU distance sale of goods. It works as a great alternative to having to register in all member states where your customers are located, and it's only for the B2C cross-border sales. So it really does help that growth for your business if you're only looking to hold stock for distribution in one member state and really just test the market, see which is going to be the most popular for yourselves and your products, especially if you have many different kind of GSPR needs, GPSR needs, and EPR as well. So, and also as it states there at the bottom, for it to apply, goods do have to be located in the EU at point of sale as well. Looking at it in practice, I've gone through this a little bit, but it's good to look at it further in depth as well. So you register in the one country where you're planning to hold stock. If, for example, we're looking at that cosmetics company and they decide to, open up Amazon in Germany or France, but also then hold a 3PL warehouse in Germany, as well as holding it in Netherlands, they will only need the one-stop shop registration for their own website distributions. So it will firstly be registered in the Netherlands. They can also then use that registration for goods going from Germany to other EU member states as well. It's for reporting of all eligible supplies and for you to charge the local VAT rates on the supplies. As we tied back previously as well, it's really important to make sure you're collecting that correct amount of VAT, whether it's standard, reduced, or zero rated. It's a single online quarterly VAT return, single VAT payment to the member state where you're registered. So in this scenario, Netherlands. And it does have to be the member state where the goods are dispatched from. It's similar to the Euro number where it's the first point of entry, so the first member state. And the member state of identification will then distribute the relevant VAT amounts to the member state where your customer is located. You also need to keep the records for 10 years. I think the last point there is really important because when having, these discussions, it's great to really hone in on, you only have this one payment. You don't have to worry about the individual split up of these payments at all. So it is really great, especially if you're holding and looking at that growth and expansion. And looking forward then, we have some commonly asked questions that we're going to start looking into for Dave. So let's start there. So the first one I guess I have for you, Dave, is what types of products sold online fall under the GPSR? Is there any, I guess, is it all products? Yeah, it'd be great to get to hear more.
Yeah, so I already alluded to it a few times. So GPSR covers virtually every product that you can think of. I like to explain it as the fallback regulation that if it's not regulated anywhere else, it probably regulates in their GPSR. So yeah, virtually all products sold to consumers in the European Union are included in it, are in scope of it. But what I find particularly interesting is that digital products are also included. So things like apps and so on are part of it. Which that's a bit of a novelty because there's still very much things in like thinking like things like physical goods and physical risks, whereas digital products are more likely to cause cyber risks or electronic risks. So that's a bit of a novelty. Yeah, the key exceptions are definitely food and feed, medicines, plant protection products, animal byproducts. So think of like gelatin, chondroitin, collagen, antiques. Why antiques? Well, antiques probably would have been a GPSR product if they were manufactured today, but it's impossible to trace back who's manufactured what at what time for antiques. So they have been exempted from it. Low risk aircrafts, GMO products, type of food products, they're also exempt from this, and certain transport equipment. But actually, all of them makes a lot of sense because all of those products are very heavily regulated from international distribution and have their whole regulatory sphere before they can even get onto the market.
That's super interesting as well because I think, as you mentioned and highlighted, the digital products, I would never have thought of that myself directly. I think I've always assumed it's always physical. So it's
Yeah.
really interesting that it also applies to those as well, I guess. Would it be all digital products, say, for example, like courses as well? Or is it just, I guess, apps, would you say, usually?
Yeah, I think the point really is that the European Union doesn't really have time to review regulations very often. So the last time they did was 20 years ago, and this is very much a looking ahead of the future. So laying a framework of like digital products that might be developed in the fourth industrial revolution with AI and so on. Like there's been a lot of other work like in the Digital Services Act in the European Union about safeguarding European consumers from the rollout of AI technologies and so on. So those type of like new novel technologies will find their way inadvertently into consumer products and the Internet of Things. So the consumer goods of the future will not be completely disentangled from internet use. So for that reason, like the digital products are already included for that reason.
Perfect. I guess, yeah, leading on to that, then the next question that I guess is commonly asked is what information must be displayed on product listings for EU customers? Or is that, is it kind of as much as you can, I guess?
So product listings are obviously the listings online. So the key information is identification of the product itself. So we're looking at typically there would be like on Amazon would be an ASIN number, a SKU number, or a serial number. They're very important, as I mentioned before. That has to do with product recall. We want to minimize product recall to like the tiniest batch possible, so not thousands of products get recalled, but only the few in a small series that might be faulty. So those identification materials, identification details. The other thing that's very important is the manufacturer's details, including name, trademark, postal address, and an electronic address. But if the manufacturer is not inside the European Union, you would use the address of your appointed responsible person, where essentially the authorities and consumers can reach out to. The responsible person has a duty to keep the technical dossier on file for 10 years and make it available to the authorities. So in the old system, in the old system, there was a requirement to test for safety, and there was a requirement to put warnings on the packaging, but it wasn't a requirement for like this technical dossier in the format that we're doing it now. So as you can imagine, processing or investigating a non-compliance took a long time because it was first was a question of like, okay, what is the product risk? What kind of safety testing have you done? Does this actually apply to European standards? So there was a really drawn out process to resolve a potential non-compliance. But through the introduction of technical dossiers, the information is presented in a format that the market surveillance authorities can more readily understand. So if you work with a competent, responsible person, it's more likely that they can help you prepare for worst case scenarios, and also to help you resolve it much more quickly. So you're able to resume trading within a matter of weeks instead of months.
Perfect, thank you. I think, yeah, that's excellent. If we're looking at the next questions, then we've got a few more to kind of, I guess, run through. So I think this one kind of ties into the answers of the last one. How do online marketplaces need to handle product safety under GPSR? And just a quick follow up, I guess, on that as well is if I'm selling just on a marketplace, let's say Amazon or eBay,
Yeah.
who is responsible to ensure that that compliance is met? Is it myself or is it the marketplace?
The marketplace plays a duty in so the regulation, also the previous market surveillance regulation, they introduce different economic actors in the supply chain, and everybody plays a role and has different sets of obligations to ensure product safety. So online marketplaces, as do fulfillment service providers, play a role within removing non-compliant products from the market and informing consumers when a non-compliance or a non-compliance or products deemed unsafe that they might have bought. So an online marketplace will you are principally responsible for making sure that your products are compliant. You will need to furnish the contact details of a responsible person or of your manufacturer to the online marketplace. You need to provide information about safety warnings, and like in Amazon there's different modules that you fill out. But their role is to make sure that if there is an issue with the product, that the listings don't get taken down, and that people that might have bought that product get notified that there was a safety issue with that a safety issue has been identified with a product in a certain batch. And they obviously have those contact details so they can reach out to people.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's kind of, I guess, a little bit similar to how it works with VT because Amazon are typically somewhat liable for some compliance, but also
Yeah.
other side, it does fall on the customer. So it's interesting how it all spans out across the board when you're looking at compliance as well through marketplaces.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think, yeah, the next kind of one that ties into that, just because we've obviously spoke about marketplaces, would be if I'm selling to multiple EU countries or I'm holding stock in multiple EU countries, does it actually differentiate in the GPSR requirements or is it the same, maybe just a slightly different tweak?
So, important difference between GPSD and GPSR is that the former was a directive and the latter is a regulation. So the European Union used directives as a type of law that sets a minimum standard, and nations are allowed to have additional rules as long as they meet the minimum standards. So we agree on the minimum standards, there may be additional requirements. And the regulations, all member states of the union have to apply them in exactly the same way. So the GPS regulation is typically seen as a stronger legislative tool and a stronger tool for enforcement, and more uniformity in the market. So in that sense, the differences are not so great, and also a lot. And when there is a harmonized standard at EU level, under GPSR regulations, all of the member states will have to respect that that's the standard that was applied, and that's technically correct. But there may be some differences in nuances on what people think that you should have put in the labeling, and whether translations are requirement, how much required, how much translation is required. Some marks are a little bit more lenient on, for example, more English don't necessarily require everything to be translated, whereas others are a little bit more strict on that, and they want more information to be available in their languages.
Perfect. And I think the next kind of thing would be when you're looking at it as well. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about the product safety and everything. So if we're looking at what should an e-commerce business do if the product is found unsafe, but also on the back of that, how should we be communicating these product safety information to online customers? How would it all work? Yeah.
So without delay, if a product is found unsafe, without delay, you need to notify that as an accident. So that's the very first thing, and obviously, it would help. You would get your responsible person to help you with that. You're obliged to notify consumers that have bought a product. Again, that's why traceability is so important, because you don't want to send the warnings out to everyone who has bought your product over the last year. You only want to send it out to the people that have bought a specific product of a specific batch and serial number. And then you also have to warn the online marketplaces and market surveillance authorities of any recalls that must happen, or any safety warnings that need to go out. If you've got, for example, if you sold through your own website, you may have contact details of your consumers, so you could reach out to them directly to let them know there was an issue with the product. And then you're either obliged to repair it, or to compensate people who bought the product, depending on the level of damages, if it's just a small defect or if it's a serious accident.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think, looking at we've already discussed this one quite a lot, but I guess in a simple layman's terms, what role does the EU responsible person play in e-commerce? Obviously, it's a very important role, but I guess a brief summary about what that would look like.
So the EU responsible person is, first of all, you need to have someone who is local. That's a hard requirement. If the manufacturer is not based in the European Union. So many people who sell GPSR products might be manufacturing in China, in Latin America, or in America or Australia. So they're non-EU manufacturers. So the responsible person plays a role in that representation. The second thing is that the responsible person also has intimate knowledge of the European regulations and standards, and is in a position to advise and guide brands on which standards they should apply, and also they will be able to compare standards and certifications that you already have, whether or not they are equivalent to European standards. So sometimes there are harmonized standards at EU level, which are copied over from like maybe an ISO standard, so that or incorporating an ISO standard. So the same. So you might have been certified by ISO, and there might be a European equivalent to that. So a responsible person plays an important role in verifying what the requirements are, determining whether you already have the relevant information to avoid an unnecessary cost in additional testing, and then to facilitate with liaison with the national authorities. And then in a case of an accident reporting, they can help you report the accident and help you with the recall procedures.
Perfect. Thank you. And I think we just have like 2 more questions here. The next one is going to be a bit interesting, but it's one that we found to be most commonly asked, really. So are product reviews regulated under GPSR, or is it just the products itself?
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting question. So I would say to that product reviews are obviously reviews that people have left on a product listing, right? So what's important is you do some monitoring of the market. So it's easy if someone reaches out to you and writes an email or sends you a letter or phones you up to say, I had an issue with this product and this and this and this is what happened, and you can follow up and you have a good idea, you can record what's happened. Product reviews are probably a bit more subtle because the issues with the products might not be serious enough for people to necessarily report it or claim compensation, but there's still valuable insights, but then because they might point to use cases or, or might demonstrate how people use your product that you didn't necessarily think of, that you can either design out of the product or improve the product to make it more user friendly down the line. So are they regulated on the GPSR? I don't believe so, but they definitely a very, very valuable source of understanding how people work with the product.
Yeah, I mean, personally, when I'm buying anything online, I do tend to look at the reviews first. So I guess
Yeah.
there's designs that. And then the last one that we've got today is just going to be, what are the traceability requirements for e-commerce sellers? Just
So for again, make sure that you got the serial numbers of products, batch numbers, SKU numbers. Just make it as narrow as possible, and try. There's no fixed way how you code things, but just don't assign the same code to every batch that comes from a specific manufacturer, because there are differences too. So make sure you got a system that you apply in the same way, so you know exactly at what date what products came to you or what date it left, what product left the manufacturer, so you can trace that down. Make sure that you record that on, for example, invoices, and on the packaging itself, so that if people report defects to the product, that you can ask them for that information. You can trace that down quite efficiently. And then make sure that you got the details of the manufacturer. So you might be changing manufacturers in the process. So some products you might have two manufacturers supplying the same product. So make sure that you got both those details also correctly written down. So you know anything that has this batch number comes from this manufacturer. Anything that has that batch number might come from manufacturer B.
Perfect. Well, I think that's kind of all of the questions we have. So firstly, thank you so much, Dave, for answering those questions. I think it's been really insightful to learn a bit more about GPSR and general kind of, I guess, expansion into the EU markets and what's required, because I'm sure, when you're looking at these things, it can get quite confusing, but I think it's really helped, especially myself, understand a bit more about what this is. So thank you so much for those.
Thank you for your time, Liam.
Well, thank you so much. As mentioned, we will have some key resources available as well. So we will be sending out some emails following this kind of webinar today, and we'll have some blogs about what GPSR is and what the EU VAT for e-commerce would look like for you. And thank you so much. If you have any questions on any of the VAT requirements that we've discussed today or any of the GPSR products, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Dave. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you soon. And thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.